Dan Greenstein is the Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. The 2024-25 state budget was passed in July. How much funding will the state system receive this next year?
So we got an additional $35.1 million. So it was a 6% increase in our annual appropriation. Plus, we got an additional $85 million in one-time funding, which will help out a number of our schools with some of their debt issues, which is just fantastic and really helps us just continue to make up ground financially. It's fantastic.
How does this funding match up with previous year funding?
So it's I think we got about 6% last year as well. We've had about a 30% increase since I've been here, really beginning, I think, in 2020. And it's been a heck of a journey, rebuilding our relationship with the state, really rebuilding trust in both chambers, obviously with the executive branch, both sides of the aisle, helping folks understand and putting ourselves in a position where Pennsylvania State System universities are something that legislators want to invest in and should. We're a good deal. We're a good deal for the state and, of course, for our students. And so I'm pleased by the result.
You mentioned rebuilding trust. What were some of the concerns that you had to address?
So when I arrived in 2018, the Pennsylvania state system had experienced, I don't know, about a decade's worth of enrollment decline. It hadn't adjusted its expenditure to match its new enrollment realities. And of course, enrollment drives revenue. About 65-70% of our revenues come from student tuition. And so, there were these challenges that were well recognized in terms of our financial health. There were also, issues, there were concerns that we continued to raise tuition on students. There was concerns that our smaller schools, often many of them rural, really didn't have a pathway to a successful future, that there wasn't really any strategy for sustaining them and sustaining their work going forward. So, I would hear these things every time I would visit with a legislator, both sides of the aisle, frankly, concerns and there was the sense that, look, we want to invest in public higher education. We believe in public higher education, but you got to kind of sort yourselves out and demonstrate. And it really wasn't about the universities or the faculty so much. I think it was about the overall management of the system. Demonstrate that the system is responsibly and sustainably managed, that it's responsive to students' needs, it's responsive to their the employer needs of skilled workers. And so we set ourselves a task of responding to making a number of promises on those fronts, responding to all of them, making progress against all of them. And the legislature, as we did that, turned around and reinvested significantly. I think it was 2021 with a 16 or something percent increase, followed by a couple of years of 6.5%. And significant one-time funding, some of that with COVID relief dollars, but much of it not. And so really, partnering with us to stabilize and stand up the system so that it can continue its historic mission, which is, basically ensuring the Pennsylvania economy remains strong.
After the budget was passed, the decision was made to freeze tuition again this year. How important is that for your students?
Super important. We have not, I've been chancellor for 6 years. I've never recommended a tuition increase. So that's pretty good. Our students have had, I think this will be the 7th year of flat tuition. I think it translates into, students are now paying 25% less than they would have in 2018 in terms of real dollars. So and of course, what happens is as tuition was held flat, and of course, our universities work really hard to keep room and board costs down as well. So, and as the cost or the price, the net average price that the students paid for their education, was flat, we also heaped money into student financial aid, institutional aid, the money that basically universities take out of their operating budgets and give to students in terms of scholarships. Give them as scholarships. That increased significantly from like $80 to $140 million a year. And of course, what happens is that our enrollment trend changed. Instead of losing students year on year, we saw an uptake in first-time students. Price really matters. Our schools, public education is designed for low and middle income, for the people of Pennsylvania, right? It is the way, we're so good at, we're really about creating Main Street, not Wall Street jobs, although I'm sure some of our students go into Wall Street. But we're driving our regional economies. And of course, we're taking students from low and middle income households and launching them into very successful careers. And that price really matters. And as a result, we're very high value. And I think the state sees that in ways that are reflected in our funding.
Now, the budget also includes the provision for a new board of higher education. What would that board do?
So I think it remains to be seen. It is fashioned after the State Board of Education, which has been a kind of coordinating body that brings stakeholders together across both K-12 and higher post-secondary education. So this is sort of carved out of the higher education component. And the idea is that it provides the kind of coordination that would improve student opportunity and student outcomes across the state. It would make recommendations to the legislature, I understand, having to do with how funding flows. It would make recommendations about how institutions across higher education can work together. It's really important that we do that. If you think about it, a student today, someone who enters higher education today, whether they're at whatever age, is going to continue to go back and forth between higher education and the workforce, right? They're going to continue to reskill and upskill as they advance their careers and go forward in life, right? So we have to, and it's unlikely that that learner is going to always go back to the same institution, right? They're going to move around, and they should, because offerings are different, their needs are different. So that means that we have to collaborate to ensure that student can move around, that the next credential they get from another, recognizes all their past successes in education. So that requires a high degree of interoperability in a way, and a degree of coordination that doesn't exist. So there would be one other example of the kind of work that the state board could do. But I understand that, my understanding is that the board will be assembled, it will meet, it will determine what its agenda really is, and then make a recommendation some months out to the General Assembly. So I look forward to seeing that happen. It's where such boards exist elsewhere in the country, they can be incredibly powerful. I mean, powerful in a good way for students.
Were you involved in the development of the board?
So, I mean, there was a lot of conversations that resulted in the legislation. And I was certainly involved in any number of those conversations, as were many people. I mean, it was an inclusive process, and I think it was ultimately a good one. I think ultimately a good result.
Now, in a recent press release, you talked about U.S. higher education is struggling at any number of levels in any number of ways. The risks are profound. The crises are real. Why is higher education in a crisis?
Oh gosh, at so many levels in so many ways. So, I think, so let's start with the kind of crises that or challenges that we face. They're financial, largely. As state funding has been diminished over time, and this is across the country, the universities in the public sector in particular have increased generally speaking, have increased tuition. And of course, that puts a greater burden on students who are beginning to not enroll in the same numbers that they used to going forward, which is a problem for the economy. Where do you get your nurses from? Where do you get your teachers from? Where do the engineers come from? Because they all require some form of post-secondary education. But it's challenged in other ways as well. I mean, it's almost there's almost not a week goes by where you don't read in the press something having to do with the public losing trust or losing faith in the quality and value of higher education. And you see polls, a recent one by Lumina and Gallup, and they do one every year, which just shows continuing decline and it's interesting because when you ask people, is higher education, is post-secondary education the way to get a good job? There's large scale agreement, but people don't trust that higher education is managed effectively, managed efficiently. There's real concerns that it's ideologically driven. The challenges that emerged around the war in the Middle East over the last several months was, even though it was largely concentrated in highly selective universities that serve very privileged people, I think there's this it sort of bred this general distrust in higher ed. So, on the one hand, you've got this sort of fragile set of institutions, but on the other, they're absolutely essential to social mobility and workforce development. So how do we square that circle? How do we get back to a place where higher education cultivates the public trust that it needs in order to sustain and to serve the nation? And I don't think any of those answers are straightforward. I mean, there's the financial issues, which are challenging enough, and then you layer onto that the sort of political public trust issues that are there also complex. Then there's other stuff going on. You've got aging out of like everybody else. Our employees are getting older, and it's not clear that they're being kind of reproduced. They're not coming in the same number. How do we recruit and retain talent? So you've got issues that are true, and there's disruption that results from technology and how technology is changing artificial intelligence in particular, everything we do. So it is an industry undergoing massive change and the results of those changes, I think, will affect the health of the country, certainly the health of the economy.
One of the things that we're also seeing at colleges around the country is the reduction or elimination of programs in the humanities. What happened to this? These used to be key aspects of a college education. Are people losing confidence in those types of programs?
Well, so I think there's a number of things going on. I mean, so first of all, the data suggests that people who pursue a degree in the humanities are not, we have data on our students, graduate 1, 3, 5, 10, whatever years after graduations. And the humanists and the social scientists, they don't do quite as well as the business and the IT people, but they do pretty well, and they're certainly getting a good return on their investment. And that's true in a lot of places. I think, but as the price of higher education gets higher, and it's the opportunity cost gets greater for the students pursuing, some form of credential. There's and there should be a greater kind of thought given to, okay, what am I going to get out of this? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? And it puts, sort of pressure on us to think really hard about, okay, how are we equipping the learner, whether they come to us right out of high school or they're an adult coming back to, higher education to get a credential, reskill or upskill or whatever. To us to think really, what kind of value are we offering folks? I think the benefit of a Pennsylvania State System school is that the degrees that we offer are grounded in a general education. So even the scientist and the IT professional and the business professional is going to have some background in general education, liberal arts, and that's a good thing. And all of the kind of research that I've seen suggests that those general education, liberal arts education provide students with the communication skills, the dot connecting, the critical thinking skills that employers really seek pretty aggressively. So we provide students with those sort of, sometimes they're called soft skills, through the general education, and we layer on the kind of technical aspects they need maybe to get a first job. I think we've got the best of both worlds at our schools.
Another part of the state budget is the Grow Pennsylvania Merit Scholarship Program. What would that do?
So Grow Pennsylvania, we've been advocating for this kind of thing for a while, and it's fantastic. I mean, it basically says, look, to a student who wants to pursue a career in a high demand area like teaching and nursing, where we're just struggling to keep up with the demand, that a student who pursues educational program that leads to that job, as long as they stay in Pennsylvania and work in that job for a period of time, get some form of aid, right? So that the money is available to them up front, so they can. So it will hopefully fill that pipeline, get more people into those high demand, into the programs that lead into those high demand jobs. We've been talking about this for several years with the previous administration and the current one. It's fantastic, and so we'll have an opportunity through the program. It's one of those things where, does it work? Well, you can do the math and you can do a lot of strategic analysis and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, you got to try it. And so it's going to be super interesting to see what the impacts are. Where I have seen these programs have been very focused programs on teaching, for example, in California and Texas, and they have been very effective, where they provide incentive for students to enter into programs that lead to a particular occupation. So I'm pretty optimistic, and I look forward to seeing, the results a couple of years out.
One of the key features of your tenure as chancellor has been the consolidation of several universities. Can you describe that consolidation and what was the goal of it?
Well, so it's I referred earlier to this sort of challenge that some of our universities in communities which were sort of declining population were losing 40-50% of their student body, right? And it turns out you can only offer as many programs as you can enroll students, right? And so as a school gets smaller, it necessarily has to shrink the number of programs that it offers. And of course, students want choice and they should have choice. I think one of the things we learn, of course, is that the communities that they serve also needs that program breadth, right? So our schools, particularly in the rural areas, I mean, the regions rely on them for their next generation of business, teacher, healthcare professional, et cetera. And because it's easier to grow your own than to recruit people from to move into that region. And so they're very important drivers of the regional economy. And so, you know, when you're looking for your healthcare professionals, you don't just need, you know, the geriatric nurses, you need the full range. Same with teachers, same with business people. So that programmatic breadth was absolutely critical, not just for students, but for the regions. And the only way you can sustain programmatic breadth with schools which have, you know, very small and declining numbers of students is to sort of aggregate up, basically. So now you take an institution which maybe had 2,000 students and you make it part of a structure which has 9,000 students. It's night and day what you can do, the difference in terms of what you can do. So students at like a Mansfield or Clarion, which could have maybe sustained on their own 25 or 30 majors, minors, degrees, can now have like 90 to 100. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for the student, and it's a big deal for the regional economy. So, you know, it's as one of my colleagues points out, we were kind of thrown ahead of the curve on this one. So if you look and, you know, read the higher education trade press, as I do regularly, you know, not a day goes by when there's not another, you know, integration. We were early on. I'm glad we were. Frankly, I think we had certain advantages by being thrown ahead of the curve. And of course, now this wave is sort of washing across higher education, generally speaking, and I'm kind of glad we're through it.
You talked earlier about some of the trends in enrollment and the impact of tuition on that, but there are other factors too, demographics, and people talked about the demographic cliff coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. What types of trends are you seeing in that area?
Well, I mean, you know, I think the things you read about are true. You know, we're seeing the shrinkage in the size of the high school leaving population, which has been our traditional source of students. So, you know, what universities are doing, so you can just get smaller, right? There's no penalty in getting smaller. At some point, my guess is that a university gets too small, it can't sustain itself. You have to think about sort of radical transformational strategies to overcome that small scale. But there's other things you can do, right? We're doing two things. We're trying to obviously ensure that more of the students who come to us stay with us through their graduation. So improving student outcomes. And we got ways to go. I think our overall graduation rate's around 62% for a first-time student. You know, that means there's a bunch of others who aren't graduating with us. And so what can we do to keep more? How can we raise that number? So we'll improve our enrollments a lot, and we have already, simply by improving student retention. The second thing is, and it's a question, can we serve students or learners from other sources who we haven't really tapped into? And our thinking is, yes, we can. Obviously, we've done a bit through online learning, where students who don't have the luxury or the privilege or the interest in coming and having a residential education can still participate in a degree. But we're also beginning to develop a portfolio of what we call non-degrees, credentials that make sense in the workforce, that don't take 4 and 2 years to complete, that can be really completed often in several months. And we've got a growing number of these. I think it's Act 120 schools, which are training municipal police and security folks. We have a Grow with Google partnership where students can earn Grow with Google credentials, which are IT certifications. We have various business certifications that students can earn in several months through several courses. And it's a growth area. It's good for degree-seeking students. They can begin to compile credential certifications along the way towards their degree. So if they stop out, they're still going to get a bump in the labor market, right? But it's also good for people who don't need a degree, don't want a degree, don't have the time or the interest or whatever, but who can acquire a credential and advance their career in some way. So we see this as a second and pretty significant growth area.
Are Pennsylvania schools graduating enough students to meet workforce demands?
Well, so, you know, I mean, it's basic math problem, so no. And which means that if we are going to basically keep the lights on in the economy, and I mean, you've heard that I think currently 60% of all jobs in Pennsylvania require some post-secondary education, but only 51% of adults have it. We got to fill that gap, and there are not enough high school leavers to do that, which means we have to reach into other populations in the way that I've described, with maybe not degrees, not bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, but credentials that are valuable in the marketplace. And that's going to be important. Whether it's adult or continuing or lifelong learning or however you want to talk about it, we're going to have to think hard. We're public owned. We are a state-owned institution. We are in service to the state. This is an urgent need of this state, and we're owned by the state. So for us not to think about this would be I think, a problem. And we're very active in this area.
What are some of the key sectors that are being affected by this?
Oh, healthcare is the one that I hear about all the time, and just talking to leading providers in the state, and they'll tell you, as of today, we need X thousand of nurses. We have that many vacancies. I mean, starving. Teaching, and you obviously hear a lot about that, but I hear about it in financial services, right? You also hear about it in the trades, interestingly. So it's pretty widespread. It's not just isolated in areas that require sort of a degree-based education. So it's widespread in financial services, accounting, engineering, IT. It was only a few years ago that Pennsylvania's bid to host Amazon 2 or whatever failed, in part because the state doesn't produce enough software engineers. It's a challenge across any number of different sectors. And of course, our programs over time have evolved so that our programs focus, I think, like almost 3/4 of our graduate with degrees in programs that lead directly into high demand jobs. So we're sort of positioned to really address these challenges, I think, in a profound and powerful way.
Now we're a few years down the line from the COVID shutdown. Are we still seeing any kind of lingering effect from that period?
Yes, I think we are. I mean, I still think that, people talk about learning loss. I think we're going to see these effects for a long time. There was some interesting research on Hurricane Katrina, which basically, the hurricane is a major disruptive event, and it affects everybody who's in the education pipeline, from age 5 to age whatever, 24. And it takes 18 years for those people to move through the pipeline. And my expectation is we will see lingering effects for a while. So learning loss is certainly, one thing that we're seeing. I think we're seeing interesting challenges, students who don't necessarily have the kind of social, emotional, behavioral sort of, skills, I guess, that are required to do really well. They need a lot more sort of support in colleges, putting pressure on our, not just our mental health and wellness supports, but also just on our student supports, generally speaking. It's hard to is that part of just contemporary society creating a lot more pressure and anxiety on students, or is it an effect of COVID? But it's certainly real, and it's certainly picked up since COVID, and I would expect it to continue.
Now, most of our institutions faced a very real shock when the shutdown came. Are the PASSHE schools, have they developed new procedures, new processes? Do you think that they're more resilient at this point?
I do. I think the other interesting change is that there's a whole different set of attitudes towards, I'm going to call it hybrid learning. Students almost expect, and we've seen it, there was this, we measure proportion of students who take at least one course online per term or something like that. It's a standard measure and the numbers, of course, got up to 90+% during COVID. And then they fell back, but only to about 70%, where they were at about 40% before COVID. So there's this new attitude among students. So wait a minute. It's like, why isn't it available to me on my terms? I don't want to. And there's I think a new and a different kind of openness to online learning amongst faculty. So I think there's not a massive thing, but it's a subtle thing. I think it's been beneficial to the integrated universities, frankly, because they have a higher reliance on hybrid forms of instruction. And it happened kind of at the right time because it's just generally more accepted. And then, frankly, there's even more demand among students. I think that's going to push us pretty hard in an interesting and in a good way to think about how to deliver learning more flexibly in a more personalized way.
Now, this summer you announced that you will be leaving your position as chancellor in October. Why have you decided to move on?
Well, so at some point you get to a point in your life. I guess I'm there. I got there a little while ago, and you realize that you've got more runway behind you than you have ahead of you. And you begin to have, and that thought occurred to me. It was probably in the middle of the night. It was a horrific, sleepless night. And then you think to yourself, where do I want Where do I want to, to me, I believe so profoundly, so powerfully in the mission of higher education. I can't imagine a future without it. And, in ways that we've discussed, it's just challenged across the country. And, if I have 10, 15, however many years, I'm not a young man, whatever time I have left, I want to spend it. I want to spend it helping to support an industry I believe in and can't imagine a world without. And I want to ensure that I can provide that support on the largest, have the largest amount of impact that I possibly can with the time remaining. And that became a real and kind of, that coupled with the fact that, we've done some good work here at the Pennsylvania State System. I think it's more stable than it was. I think its universities work very effectively together. We've got great leadership in our presidents. We've got great leadership in our board and our chancellor's office. And, it's never a good time, and the work is always great and it's exciting and there's so much more to do. But, there's almost this sense in which you feel that this kind of work has been institutionalized and will carry forward and good things will continue to happen. And I can go pay attention and support others who are maybe less fortunate.
We've been speaking with Dan Greenstein. He is the Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Great to see you. Appreciate it.